today we're going to talk about a previous policy analysis, the idea that Congress should abolish New Starts and replace it with a formula fund that distributes money to transit agencies based on their ridership and or the fares they collect. I mentioned some of these numbers on Sunday, but not everybody was here on Sunday, so I want to go over it just a little bit. In 1990, Las Vegas had very low transit ridership. And among four major Rocky Mountain cities, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Denver, and Salt Lake City, it had the lowest share of commuting. Transit carried the lowest share of commuting in any of those four cities. And then, after 1990, Denver, Phoenix, and Salt Lake all built light rail lines. Meanwhile, Las Vegas stuck with buses, and they did do some innovative bus rapid transit lines. And by the year 2010, Las Vegas had remarkably doubled transit's share of ridership. Now, this is the fastest growing community in the United States during those years, so transit ridership grew by a lot more than double, but doubled the share of ridership, and that's very, very unusual to find any city anywhere in the country that has doubled its share of ridership. Meanwhile, Denver and Salt Lake share of ridership declined, share of commuting declined. Phoenix grew just a little bit, but Phoenix didn't start building light rail until well after Denver and Salt Lake, so the effects of light rail on the bus system probably haven't really been felt yet. But the point is that Las Vegas went from being last to being first in terms of share of commuting as a result of focusing on buses rather than on trains. Now, why does focusing on trains harm transit ridership? Well, here's some numbers from Atlanta. We can see that Atlanta was steadily increasing the miles of rail transit over the years from 1982 to 2012. And as they increased rail transit, rail ridership grew, at least for a while, but bus ridership shrank. And so overall, ridership peaked in about 1984, and today, although it's gone up and down, today it's below 1984. Actually, it peaked here, but that's the Olympics, so that really doesn't count. So today it's below 1984, thanks to the fact that in order to build more rail miles, they've cut bus service, and bus ridership has plummeted. In Atlanta, some people call this transit apartheid, building rail to white neighborhoods, cutting bus service to black neighborhoods. And it's not just Atlanta, it happens in city after city. Here's one of the more recent ones. This is Houston. Houston actually had very fast growing transit ridership when it was bus. Then they began light rail construction. Bus ridership immediately started declining. Today it's gone from 99 million trips per year to 77 million trips per year. Total, bus plus rail, is 77. A devastating decline in ridership, devastating for the transit, devastating for transit riders. And yet they want to build more rail. Now, I want to show you three particular rail lines. This is the Portland commuter rail called the West Side Express. This is the Nashville Music City Star. This is the Trinity Rail Express. This is between Dallas and Fort Worth. What do these three rail lines have in common? They are all so expensive and they carry so few transit riders that it would be cheaper to give every daily round-trip rider a new Toyota Prius every year for as long as they're running these rail lines. A new one every year. They're so expensive. So rail transit is extraordinarily expensive. It leads to cuts in bus service. It harms particularly low-income riders because the rail transit is aimed at middle-class people who have plenty of transportation choices, and so a lot of people get hurt by it. So what I'm proposing is that Congress abolish the fund that it uses to encourage cities to build rail transit. It's called the New Starts Fund. It's about $2 billion a year, and the way the fund works, it's what I call a bucket of money. The first cities that grab the most money out get the most. So Portland is grabbing a hugely disproportionate share of that money because it's building so much rail transit. So other cities are saying, if we want our share, we have to build rail transit too. Now, it's not the only perverse incentive in the law, but it is the biggest one. So we look at Congress and we say, okay, we want to change the law so that we aren't giving cities these incentives to do these perverse things. How do we do it? Well, first of all, we have the Tea Party Republicans who are powerful and yet still a minority in Congress. This is, of course, our speaker from last night. But another powerful contingent in Congress are what are called the Transit Republicans. When reauthorization was up for, when transportation was up for reauthorization in 2012, the Tea Party Republicans said, well, we control the House, we will demand a reduction in spending, and we'll just have to negotiate with the Senate. They passed the bill out of the committee, and they got to the floor, and they found out the Tea Party Republicans refused to go along. Or, excuse me, the Transit Republicans refused to go along because they represented cities like Chicago and New York and Boston, and although they were a minority in those cities, still, they knew a lot of the people among their constituents relied on transit. And they didn't want to cut the budgets for transit. So they fought the Tea Party Republicans. So the first thing we have to do is win the Transit Republicans over to our side. And the way I propose to do it is cut new starts, but keep that $2 billion for transit. Give it to transit based on ridership, and then places like Chicago and Boston that aren't actually building new transit will actually win. They'll end up getting more money. There'll be places like Portland and Phoenix that are building a lot of new transit that will end up losing it, and we don't have many Tea Party or Transit Republicans from those cities. The third contingent that we have to deal with are the Democrats, of course. This is Peter DeFazio, who used to be my representative in Congress. I testified before him recently, and he looked at me puzzled and said, now, you don't believe that our whole transportation system would fall apart if it weren't for us in Congress guiding it and telling it what to do? And he just couldn't figure out that transportation didn't depend on him completely. So we, in the past, have relied on the fact that the federal deficit and federal debt is growing and saying, look, we've got this huge debt, we've got this huge deficit, we need to cut the deficit, so will you please cut the things we don't like transit, so that we can reduce the deficit and debt. And that hasn't gotten anywhere. It certainly hasn't gotten anywhere with Democrats. So I think we need to take a different tack. I think instead of focusing on the deficit, we need to focus on the other thing that fires up our base and that I think really is more personal to us, which is the social engineering. The idea that we build a rail line and then we build transit-oriented developments along the rail line, such as this one in Portland. Excuse me, that's not Portland, that's the former East Germany. Here's the one I meant to show you in Portland. The difference between them is that when the East Germans got their freedom, when they unified with West Germany, they all moved out, and that was scheduled to be torn down when I took that picture. Because they all moved into single-family homes. But in Portland, we've made single-family home ownership unaffordable, so we've built these transit-oriented developments for people. Now notice what happened. I must have hit the wrong button here. Now notice those cars parked there. We're right next to a light rail station, so that when they built this, they only put in 2/3 of a parking place per dwelling unit. But those cars parked there, that little red sign says no parking. This is a fire lane. And there are other cars parked on the sidewalk. There are cars parked there making their own parking places because they can't live without cars, even though it's supposedly a transit-oriented development. So social engineering doesn't work. It's imposing huge costs. They gave this particular developer $13 million to put in this development. They gave them the land for free, pretty much. It's the kind of thing that is going to be happening in Plan Bay Area, where they actually said in the environmental impact report it's going to cost $14 billion to subsidize all the high-density development they want. So what I'm saying is we need to take a multi-step process. Yes, we want to cut the deficit. Yes, we want to cut the debt. But let's put that off for now. For now, let's attract the transit Republicans by keeping money for transit but redistributing it based on a formula rather than a grant program, an open bucket program. Second, we'll tell the Democrats, okay, we'll keep on deficit spending on transportation. We'll give you that as long as we take the social engineering out and see if we can win on those grounds. And then later on, after we take out the social engineering, after we take out the pork barrel and so on and so forth, to tell you the truth, if there's no pork barrel, Congress will lose interest in it, and then we'll be able to cut the deficits rather than doing it now. So that's my proposal, that's my strategy, and I'm hoping that the other three people on the panel will tell us how we can win on that.